1978, a very important essay by an influential speculative fiction, not only writer, but you could say critic and reviewer, Poul Anderson, was published, and it's called Of Thud and Blunder. Now, it was a piece of its time criticizing some of what was going on in the contemporary fantasy in the 1970s being published, but it still remains highly relevant today for its stress on what it is that people who are going to write, it could be, fantasy, it could also be science fiction, other kinds of speculative fiction, need to do if they want their writing to be any good in the long run, if it's going to be something that will captivate readers and draw them in. So he begins with this sort of satirical passage. With one stroke of his 50-pound sword, Gnortz the barbarian lopped off the head of Njaliv the wizard. I'm not going to go on and read the rest, but you get the idea, right? So we're talking about definite swords and sorcery type of stuff. And he says, today's rising popularity of heroic fantasy or sword and sorcery, and I want to pause right there because when we talk about fantasy, there are a number of subgenres, and sword and sorcery and heroic fantasy, very important part. He abbreviates it to one locution, HF, for a while, but then he also uses EF, which suggests that maybe this also includes epic fantasy, because he does, in fact, mention a few epic fantasy authors as well. So I think we can say fantasy in general is being targeted, and he says this is a great thing for those of us who enjoy it. Probably it's part of a larger movement back towards old-fashioned storytelling with colorful backgrounds, events, and characters. Tales wherein people do take arms against a sea of troubles and usually win. And he says, this kind of literature is not inherently superior to the introspective or symbolic kinds, but neither is it inherently inferior. And he says, Homer and James Joyce were both great artists. Homer is writing what's essentially, legend-based fantasy, very heroic stuff. James Joyce, preeminent modernist author. His characters are definitely not heroic. And so, we've got two different kinds of things, and they can be equally good. But oftentimes they're not. And why not? So Anderson's not going to worry about the modernist stuff, what makes it good or bad. He's going to talk about what makes fantasy bad when somebody doesn't put in the work. He says, every kind of writing is prone to special faults. While no one expects heroic fantasy to be of ultimate psychological profundity, it is often, unfortunately, simple to the point of being simplistic. Simple is not bad. Too simple, that's a problem. And he says, worse, because it's still more obvious and still less excusable, is a frequent lack of elementary knowledge or of plain common sense. So let's pause on that for just a moment. So what is the implication of this? If you are going to write heroic fantasy, really any historically connected fantasy, you really need to do some research. You can't just make it all up based on whatever tropes you've accumulated in your head, particularly nowadays when we're inundated with TV and comic books and stuff like that give us all sorts of mistaken ideas about what a person could actually have or how society could work. And then you need common sense. You need to think things through. It's not enough just to say, well, Gork the barbarian, he's a barbarian. I guess he can just wear a loincloth everywhere. What about when it's cold? Well, I guess he puts on some leather garments. Well, leather's not going to keep you from getting cold. Oh, yeah, okay. And you can go down a process of thinking these things through and figure out what you would actually need to do. And, as he points out, some of the better authors do a lot of this. He brings up Sprague de Camp, Fritz Leiber, J.R.R. Tolkien, and there's plenty of others as well that could be brought up. So he's saying that if you don't do your homework without adequate homework, then the story is going to fail. It will fail to carry the conviction, the illusion of the reality, which helps make the work of people like Tolkien or Leiber and other good writers memorable. At best, it will drop into oblivion. At worst, it will stand as an awful example. If our field, he says, gets swamped with this, then readers are going to go elsewhere for entertainment. And at the very end, he's going to talk about, the imaginary world, as he says, has to work right, or as he'll say later, it needs to make sense. And then he says there's a correlation here. The more it does, the more the reader will enjoy, and the more he will come back for more. Why are we still reading Fafhrd and the Grey Mouser stories? Because Fritz Leiber wrote some great stories. Why are we still reading, Tolkien's Silmarillion, The Lord of the Rings, The Hobbit? Because they're awesome stories, because they were well thought through. And, there can be some erroneous parts that don't quite make sense, but there's other parts that certainly do. And, when we look at Tolkien's letters, you see he put a lot of thought into his world, right? So what are the things that authors need to attend to? Not an exhaustive list. You could think of Anderson as sort of carrying out a type of triage, saying what are the most vital things that we need to attend to that people are often screwing up. So he begins by talking about economic and social life, and he tells us that, most of the cultures in high fantasy are based on the European, often as a mishmash of Roman Empire, Dark Ages, High Middle Ages, with a few other things. And that's not bad. I do think the time, he says, is overpassed for drawing inspiration from other milieus, Asian, Near Eastern, North and Black African, American Indian, Polynesian, and the entire world. And he says, I'm seeing people do that. That's great. I'm going to focus on Europe because that's where most of the stories are being drawn from and situated. So he says, even the writers I've cited, so Sprague de Camp, J.R.R. Tolkien, Fritz Leiber, say little about the producing classes in their world, with the notable exception of de Camp. The fact is, it takes a lot of peasants, artisans, and such like humble people to support one noble, or for that matter, one bandit or roving barbarian. We tend to forget this in our mechanized modern Western civilization, where only a small percentage of the workforce is occupied with the necessities of life. Up until the 20th century, that was not the norm, and so the bulk of human beings are actually engaged in some sort of production or transportation of what's being there, support work in other ways. And so he says, our creator of heroic fantasy can gain verisimilitude. Now, verisimilitude is a very important term in writing. It means the appearance of truth, similitude and verum. How do you produce something that conveys a certain kind of denseness and richness and truth to it? Well, paying attention to the lower classes, the vast majority of the world's population. Their situation affects what his hero can do. He has a little digression here about mercenaries, but you can think of mercenaries as working people too, right? And then he says, returning to peasants, laborers, merchants, and the rest, how well off are these people? How leisured, how independent? This has varied tremendously throughout history. And so he talks about the difference between free landholders in Scandinavia, eventually in Denmark becoming outright serfs. People in the cities working under long, hard hours. And he says the status of ordinary people is dependent on social conditions just as much as on technology. And, government demands on them had a huge impact. Then he moves on to talking about the medieval city. So a lot of fantasy is situated in cities. What are cities like? Again, not like the cities, except, with rare exceptions, that we experience in the present. He says, a medieval city was curiously divided. On the one side, you have a highly organized world of guilds and all sorts of rules and things like that. On the other side, the poor sector was chaotic and dangerous. And he says, between internal revenue and welfare, we seem to be reapproaching this dichotomy. In an ancient or medieval town, districts were usually divided along occupational lines. So a rich merchant would live near the appropriate street, but his house would stand out like an island in the middle of poverty, vice, and savagery. He talks about darkness, and he says, we really don't have much experience of the kind of darkness that medieval cities had. You could have people carrying around torches, but even that, it was hard to see. It was dangerous. Crime would happen a lot at night, right? He also talks about, a lot of the cities were kind of gross, Horses are pooping all over the place. People are too. Graveyards. There's no, formaldehyde preserving the bodies, so they're stinking out the place. And he says, we need to think about diseases. Typhoid, cholera, smallpox, bubonic plague. The fear of them was ever present in everybody's minds. And so, this is something that we really need to think about. And he talks about, we need to explore the relations between the city and the rest of the society. It's not just city and countryside. There's all sorts of other aspects and elements to be explored. Then he talks about politics and religion. And he says these are often neglected in heroic fantasy. So he says politics in general, much neglected. The church raises the subject of religion in general, which is little used in our field. We could actually draw a lot by focusing on how politics works. He says, usually in heroic fantasy, the governments are absolute monarchies. The real world has known many different arrangements. If our monarch is tyrannical, maybe our hero leads a revolt. Little or nothing is said about the infinitely intricate mechanics of organizing a rebellion or the legal questions involved. Right? If you take over a place, but you can't actually develop legitimacy, they'll kick you right back out, right? And he says the monarchy or oligarchy won't be the only mover of society. It's never been. Not even in the contemporary Soviet Union, enslaved China. There's always other interests and groups whose leaders must be conciliated. And he uses as an example of this the FBI director, J. Edgar Hoover, who, presidents would come and go, but you couldn't get that guy out of the job, right? There's going to be people like that in medieval society as well. So he says, we need to pay attention to politics. And he says, one fantasy novel which handles politics particularly well is The Well of the Unicorn by Fletcher Pratt, who worked with Sprague de Camp on quite a few things. Then he talks about religion, and he says, we get heroes swearing by their gods, carrying through a small rite equivalent to stroking a rabbit's foot. We get a lot of obscene ceremonies in honor of assorted toad-like beings. And he says, these do have their correspondence in reality, but they're kind of outliers. How does religion actually work in societies historically? He says, it's often the fountain of, or the wellspring of literacy. How are people learning these sorts of things? These are important questions for our hero. How does the religious establishment fit in with the political, with the cities? Now we get to more and more sociological concerns. Then he brings up transportation. And he's like, this is a big problem in a lot of fantasy. We're used to reasonably reliable and well-sprung automobiles on smooth roads when we don't fly, so we've forgotten how hard it is to get from one place to another. And then he talks about Roman roads. Roman roads were built for military purposes. Other people could use them, but often they had to be on dirt tracks. And when it gets muddy, that is tough going, right? And he says, not just mud, but wilderness impeded travel. Huge areas of Europe were covered by forests that, now notice this, because of underbrush. If you haven't actually been in a real forest, go out and explore sometime. You'll find it's not quite so idyllic and sylvan as movies where the trees are nice and far apart and you can see for quite a ways. Oftentimes you can't see 5 feet in front of you, right? What about horses, he says? Writers who have no personal experience with horses tend to think of them as a kind of sports car. That's not the case. You can't gallop them for hours. You need to alternate things. Don't let your steed eat or drink indiscriminately. It's likely to bloat and become helpless. He says, in fact, it's a rather fragile creature requiring close attention. So that needs to be part of these stories if we want to produce verisimilitude. And he says, learning to fight on horseback, that is tricky too. That's why the Vikings didn't fight on horseback. They would ride places, then they'd get off and fight on their feet as infantry. So he talks about that, and then he gets to one big stereotype. Frequently, in historical and Western fantasy, the hero cavorts around on a snorting stallion. Now, this has been done in reality, but seldom, and that for good reason. And he tallies the reasons up there. You're probably going to get yourself hurt. You better not be around any women who might distract the stallion. So, these are all important things. What about, so you're not going to go by land, go by sea. And he says, ships in fantasy normally have sails, but act as if they had diesel engines. They take the lead character where he wants to go fast, effortlessly, and comfortably. They're never becalmed. They never meet weeks of bad weather. They can go as close to the wind as the captain chooses. But this is not reality, right? And he says, in actuality, the first law of the sea, as formulated by Jerry Pornell and myself, is it's in the bilge. You need to be paying attention to all the little, mechanics of things in order to keep things going. And he says, the average fantasy sailor has no navigation woes, but this was not solved until the 18th century. So, a lot of the people sailing weren't quite sure where they were going. So, take those things into consideration. Then he's going to finish up by talking about fighting. And he says, first off, more soldiers up until about World War II died of disease than did in action. So you probably want to take account of that. And then he says, let's consider sociology as well. The Roman legionary usually won because they were drilled and disciplined. It was their job. And if they fought against barbarians who were not as well trained and organized, they would usually win until they became, as he says, staffed by the barbarians themselves. And so, he says, the institutional basis of warfare is very important. And then we have, of course, technology that's going to play a role. And he says the longbow was driven off the field by the crossbow by the musket, not because these were successively superior, but they were quicker and easier to teach a person their use. And he says the fantasy writer ought to visualize just what kind of arms his characters employ and think through their implications. So, what does this look like? He says, there's a lot of ways that you can approach this. You can join the Society for Creative Acronym. You can actually just read books and stuff like that. And if you do that and you visualize before you write, you're going to see nobody would grab a sword two-handed, raise it over their head, and chop straight down, exposing their belly all the while. Shields are incredibly important in warfare, and people would use them in offensive ways that are not being discussed in this. They're not just counterweights for doing some sort of roundhouse. He says, nobody can wield a 50-pound sword. You'd wear out your arm in short order. Fortunately, there aren't any 50-pound weapons, right? And he says, the long axe, that's about 5 pounds, but spend some time with it, and you'll see how quick you get tired. And then he talks about swords in particular. And he says, you can't just parry swords with swords indiscriminately. You're going to blunt them. You're going to break them. That's what you have a shield for, or some other sort of thing. Swords need a lot of attention to them. He says, sometimes they bend and must be straightened with a foot and an oath. They can break. Not even with a samurai sword do you cut through armor, right? And, he doesn't really talk about this, but it's been discussed a lot in fantasy circles. Historically, Swords are just one of a variety of weapons. Spears are actually much more common and sometimes more effective. Axes, there's a good reason why they get used a lot. Clubs and maces, there's, quite a few other possibilities. Then he talks about armor, and he says, armor does have vulnerabilities. Not so much to the thrust of the cleaving blow, and, he talks about experiments with chainmail, plate armor, and if a person is getting hit hour after hour, they're not going to be able to endure that if heat prostration doesn't get them first. But armor could also be pierced by a hard-driven arrow sometimes. And he says if armor is not involved, ordinarily in fiction, a single blow, thrust, or arrow suffices to drop a human being or a horse dead on the spot. Is that really the case? No, people can sometimes fight with many, many wounds. And so unless you actually get, the throat or something in the back of the neck or something like that, you're probably not going to kill somebody straight off with one thrust or blow. And then finally, he's going to talk about two other things. Poisons. This is a trope in fantasy. It's usually the bad guys using poison. And he says, medieval and Renaissance princes lived in terror of these. But the fact is that prior to modern chemistry, there were virtually no quick-acting toxins you could slip to somebody unbeknownst or on the point of a weapon. He mentions curare, but that's South American. And he says, I've seen a couple Renaissance recipes for poisons to feed dinner guests. And the main question about them is how anybody ever imagined somebody could gag down enough of that stuff to suffer serious damage. And he brings up, arsenic, hemlock, toad schools, ground glass, and he says, people don't die of this stuff right away, and they're going to notice when they're eating it or drinking it, right? And he says, I think that a lot of deaths that were attributed to poison were probably caused by botulism. And then he says, let me finish up with one other thing. Another flaw is the glossing over of pain, mangling, and the ordinary grim process of dying. We don't want to get sadistic. We are also, reading and writing for fun, but a little bit of realism would lend convincingness. So where do we conclude? He comes back to the point, if your world actually makes sense, because you've done your research and you've thought things through, well, then it's going to have that verisimilitude that will draw readers in and keep them there and keep them coming back for more. Failing to do that, you get something that's a much more inferior fantasy product.